The conference hall in Riyadh glowed with gold, marble, and a silence so heavy it could break stone. Every delegate sat tight as Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman entered with the weight of a man who believed the world was his marketplace. Cameras blinked. Advisors straightened. Deals whispered in the air like smoke. But across the table sat a man who didn't flinch, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, in his simple uniform that somehow outshined every jewel in the room. MBS leaned forward, voice low but dripping with power. "Africa has a price, Captain." "Everything does." Gasps echoed. Some nodded. Others waited to see if Traoré would fold like so many before him. But Traoré didn't blink. He simply studied the prince, as if measuring the exact weight of arrogance in his words. Then he smiled, small, sharp, lethal. "Then you can't afford it." A ripple tore through the hall. Advisors froze. Translators hesitated, unsure if they should repeat words that could ignite a geopolitical earthquake. But Traoré wasn't done. He spoke slowly, each word carrying the history of a continent carved by blood and extraction. "Africa is not a marketplace," he said. "Not anymore. Not for those who think gold buys dignity or oil buys silence. You speak of price because your world sees everything as currency. My world sees sacrifice, land, ancestors, and sovereignty." MBS straightened, jaw tight. He wasn't used to resistance, especially not from a soldier half the age of his usual political opponents. "Be careful, Captain. Power doesn't favor the defiant." Traoré leaned in. "Power favors the honest, and Africa is done with buyers who mistake our patience for weakness." The hall exhaled. Every camera focused on Traoré now. Every delegate whispered. Every advisor scribbled notes they knew would be studied in embassies by midnight. Because something had shifted. Not just in the meeting. Not just in Saudi Arabia. But in the global balance of who dared to speak truth inside a palace built on wealth. And for the first time, MBS realized this wasn't a negotiation. It was a warning. MBS's smile tightened when Traoré refused his offer, and the polished calm in the room began to crack. The Saudi prince leaned back in his chair, tapping the table with one finger, slow, deliberate, irritated. "General," he said, voice soft like a blade wrapped in silk, "you speak boldly for a man whose country is surrounded by giants." The diplomats around them froze. This was no longer negotiation, this was a test of dominance. Cameras recorded, advisors whispered, but Traoré didn't shift an inch. His shoulders stayed relaxed, his jaw set in iron. He didn't blink. "Giants?" Traoré replied, lifting his eyes, steady and unhurried. "Africa has buried empires far larger than yours." A few advisors gasped. MBS straightened, offended but intrigued. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a young African commander who refused to flinch. "Careful," MBS warned, raising a brow. "Diplomacy requires respect." Traoré leaned forward, elbows on the table, locking onto the prince's gaze with a calm that felt dangerous. "Respect," he said, "is earned. Not purchased." MBS's jaw tightened. His entourage looked nervous. This was becoming global theater. The prince tried again, "I'm offering you prosperity. Stability. Influence." His voice thinned. "And you answer with insults?" Traoré shook his head. "I answer with truth. Africa doesn't need to be bought. And I won't sell her dignity for $1 trillion or a throne of sand." Silence hit the room. One of MBS's men whispered something in Arabic, disbelief, maybe fear. Traoré's words were too sharp, too precise. The prince took a slow breath, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're playing a dangerous game, Ibrahim." Traoré leaned back, folding his arms. "No," he said. "I'm ending the old one." The room tightened as MBS leaned back in his chair, studying Traoré the way a billionaire studies a market he thinks he already owns. His voice lowered, smooth but sharp. "General," he said, "Africa has potential. But potential needs direction. My direction. You and I could build something, if you learn to align your ambitions with mine." It was the kind of tone world leaders usually bent their heads for, the tone of a man who expected obedience simply because he could buy everything in his path. But Traoré didn't flinch. Didn't blink. Didn't even shift in his seat. Instead, he asked calmly, "Is that what you think leadership is? Buying things that don't belong to you?" MBS raised an eyebrow. "Everything has a price." Traoré's answer was immediate, a verbal knife sliding across the table. "Not Africa." A brief silence cut the room in half. Even the staff standing along the walls shifted, sensing something dangerous in the air. MBS wasn't used to being challenged this directly, his jaw tightened for the first time. Traoré leaned forward, his voice low enough to sound like a threat, yet steady like someone stating an undeniable truth. "You want our lands. Our resources. Our future, but you didn't earn them. You didn't fight for them. You didn't bleed for them. Africa's wealth is not merchandise. And Africa's dignity is not up for negotiation." MBS's fingers drummed on the table, an irritated rhythm. "You're refusing an opportunity most leaders would crawl for." Traoré gave a quiet, humorless laugh. "Africa stopped crawling the day we remembered who we were." MBS's eyes narrowed. "Be careful, General. Pride blinds men." Traoré shook his head. "No. Pride is believing you can buy a continent with a check. Wisdom is telling you that you can't." The Crown Prince straightened, his tone shifting from persuasion to warning. "You're standing in the way of something bigger than you." Traoré's response pierced the room. "I'm standing for something bigger than you, my people." The weight of those words dropped like thunder. For a moment, even MBS looked uncertain, not of his power, but of the man sitting across from him. A man who couldn't be intimidated, couldn't be bought, couldn't be shaped. And that realization, that Africa finally had a leader who wouldn't kneel, unsettled him more than he expected. The room shifted when MBS leaned forward, his voice dropping into a cold, transactional whisper that echoed off the marble walls. "Africa plays too boldly these days," he murmured, fingers tapping the polished table like a countdown. "Every nation has a price, Traoré. You talk like a man who forgot how the world works." The advisors behind him straightened, expecting silence, expecting submission, expecting the usual. But Ibrahim Traoré didn't even blink. Instead, he tilted his head, studying MBS the same way a general studies terrain before a battle. "You think Africa is for sale because that's the only language power understands where you come from," Traoré replied. His tone stayed calm, almost too calm, but it carried weight, like a storm hiding behind a clear sky. "You buy obedience. You buy silence. You buy leaders. But you don't buy us." His fingers tapped the table once, just once. And it was enough to break the rehearsed confidence of the Saudi entourage. A flicker passed over MBS's face. Annoyance? Surprise? It didn't matter. Traoré continued before he could speak. "If Africa had a price, you wouldn't be sitting here negotiating, you'd already own it. But you don't. And the reason is simple." He leaned forward. "You can't afford us. No one can." The statement hit the room like a thrown spear. A Saudi advisor opened his mouth. And immediately shut it when Traoré's eyes cut toward him. Cameras were off, doors were locked, but Traoré spoke like the whole world was watching. "You want influence," he said. "You want land, partnerships, maybe a foothold. But what you really want is what you've never been able to buy, respect." His voice sharpened. "And respect is earned, not purchased." The words echoed long after he finished speaking, and for the first time, MBS didn't interrupt. The room tightened as Traoré leaned forward, his voice lowering into the kind of calm that made even seasoned diplomats feel unsafe. "Let me explain something to you, Prince," he said, each word landing like a hammer softened only by precision. "Africa is not a marketplace. Africa is not a vault you can buy. And Africa is not a wounded empire waiting for a savior with a checkbook." MBS's jaw flexed. His expression tried to hide the sting, but Traoré saw it. Everyone saw it. The Saudi crown prince wasn't used to hearing no, he wasn't used to someone pushing back without fear. And he certainly wasn't used to being spoken to as an equal, let alone as a man who had overstepped. You misunderstand, MBS said carefully, adjusting the cuff of his impeccably tailored thobe. When I say Africa has a price, I mean its potential is enormous. We can transform it, industrialize it, turn it into a global power. Traoré's laugh was quiet, disbelieving. Transform it? We are already doing that. You just noticed because Africa finally stopped bowing. The table of advisors exchanged looks, some hid their unease behind forced neutrality. But MBS held Traoré's gaze, refusing to look away. And what exactly do you think Africa becomes without partners like us? Traoré didn't blink. Free. For the first time, MBS hesitated. A fraction of a second. A flicker. But in diplomacy, that was enough to reveal a man's uncertainty. Traoré continued. You come offering money, investments, promises wrapped in gold. But every offer sounds like ownership. Every plan sounds like control. And every handshake feels like a leash. MBS exhaled through his nose, steady but sharper now. That is not my intention. Intentions, Traoré replied, mean nothing when your actions echo the same patterns that drained Africa for centuries. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was charged, dangerous, like the air before a desert storm. Even the guards at the door shifted their weight, unsure whether diplomacy was still the game being played. Traoré ended the moment with a single, blistering truth. If Africa has a price, then Africa is dead. And I promise you, Africa is very much alive. He sat back, unshaken. MBS swallowed, realizing the balance of power in the room had just tipped, and not in his favor. The room fell silent when Traoré leaned forward, his voice dropping into a tone so steady it felt like a warning carved into stone. You speak of Africa as if it's a marketplace, he said, his eyes locking onto MBS with an unmoving intensity. But Africa is not a shop. It is not a price tag. It is not waiting for a buyer. It decides who enters, who stays, and who is shown the door. A faint smile tugged at the corner of MBS's mouth, half confidence, half disbelief. As if he couldn't decide whether Traoré was being bold or simply naive. He rested his hands on the edge of the polished table. Everything has a price, Ibrahim, he repeated, as if the words were a universal truth. Even power. Even nations. Traoré didn't blink. That may be true in your world, he said, where loyalty is purchased and silence is negotiated. But in mine, power comes from the people. And the people of Africa are done being priced. Done being valued. Done being owned. Those days died before I was born. The Crown Prince's expression hardened, not in anger, but in calculation. Traoré's words weren't those of a leader seeking a deal. They were the words of a leader drawing a line. You misunderstand me, MBS said quietly. I offer partnership. Opportunity. Growth. Traoré shook his head. No. You offered ownership. And Africa doesn't take offers like that anymore. There was a spark in his voice now, one that turned the entire tone of the meeting. You think Africa is desperate. You think we still kneel. But look around. Look at the world now. We are not the Africa your fathers spoke about. We are rising, and we are choosing who rises with us. MBS's jaw tightened slightly. He wasn't used to being told no, especially not like this, not by someone who refused to treat him like royalty. Traoré continued, if you want to invest, invest with respect. If you want allies, come as equals. But if you think you can buy a continent. He leaned back, confident, unshaken. Then you really don't understand Africa at all. The room didn't breathe for several seconds. Because in that moment, both men understood something clearly. Traoré wasn't negotiating. He was teaching. And MBS was just beginning to understand the lesson. MBS stared at Traoré as if he were trying to decode a language he had never learned, one made of pride, unbought dignity, and a kind of authority that couldn't be printed on a bank note. You speak boldly, he finally said, his voice carrying more calculation than confidence. But boldness doesn't build nations. Money does. Power does. Traoré almost smiled. Then it's strange, he replied quietly, that the poorest men on earth often stand the tallest, while the richest bow the lowest. The room went colder. Around them, advisors shifted nervously, unsure whether to intervene or pretend they didn't hear. One of MBS's men whispered, "Your Highness, perhaps we should redirect the conversation," but MBS silenced him with a single raise of his hand. He leaned in, eyes sharp. "Africa thinks it can rise alone. That is your illusion. Africa is rising because we stopped asking permission," Traoré answered. "That is your problem." For the first time, MBS's composure cracked. "You think rejecting our money will save you?" he asked. Traoré shook his head. "No. But rejecting dependency will." He stood up, slowly, deliberately, and every movement seemed to echo louder than words. "You came here expecting a beggar," he said. "Instead, you met a man who refuses to sell his people." MBS straightened, trying to regain footing. "This conversation isn't over." Traoré stepped closer, close enough that the prince's guards tightened their stance. "It ends when Africa says it ends," he replied. A heavy silence followed, one that neither gold nor power could break. Then Traoré delivered the final line, the one that would replay across diplomatic channels for weeks. "You warned me that Africa has a price. I'm telling you, its value is beyond you." The room felt smaller now. MBS, who had walked in with the swagger of a man who buys influence, now sat motionless, staring at Traoré as if trying to decipher a code written in a language he never learned: integrity. Cameras around them kept rolling, yet the silence between the two leaders felt more powerful than any broadcast. Traoré leaned forward, his elbows resting lightly on the table, a calmness in his eyes that didn't belong to politicians, only to soldiers who had already survived the worst. "Your Highness," he began, his voice steady, almost gentle. "Africa's value was never measured in numbers. Only outsiders tried to do that. And you know why?" He didn't wait for an answer. "Because when you can't conquer a people, you try to price them." MBS's jaw tightened. "No one is talking about conquering," he said, though his voice betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. "We are talking about cooperation." Traoré nodded slowly. "Cooperation," he repeated. "A beautiful word. But in Africa, we have another understanding: cooperation is between equals. Not between someone who thinks he can buy respect and someone who refuses to be owned." A few advisors behind MBS exchanged tense glances. They hadn't expected Traoré to be this direct, or this unshakable. MBS forced a smile. "You misunderstand intentions. I am offering an opportunity. And I'm offering truth," Traoré replied. "Africa is done being someone's investment, experiment, or bargain chip. We are not a stock market. We are not oil fields. We are not your next trophy." He straightened up, his voice gaining a sharper edge. "You want to know why Africa cannot be bought? Because we buried too many of our children fighting to ensure it." The words hit like stone. Even MBS blinked. Traoré continued. "If you want partnership, real partnership, come with respect, not a price tag. If not, take your $1 trillion and buy something else. Africa is not for sale. Not to you. Not to anyone." The Crown Prince, for the first time, found no rebuttal. And Traoré's final line sealed the moment. "You warned that Africa has a price. I'm telling you. You can't afford even our dignity." He knew the world was watching. And he intended for them to hear it. Traoré didn't flinch when the journalists turned to him, waiting for a diplomatic answer, something polished and soft enough to keep the Saudis calm. But Traoré never softened anything. He stepped forward, the flags behind him fluttering under the conference hall's artificial air, and his voice cut through the noise like a blade made of iron and principle. "Let's tell the truth," Traoré began, staring directly into the cameras as if speaking to every African household watching. "Africa's worth is not measured in numbers, or in barrels, or in gold bricks weighed on someone else's scale. Our value is written in the blood of our ancestors, in the soil they defended, and in the future we refuse to sell." The room fell silent again. The reporters, who were trained to hide emotion, couldn't. A few leaned closer. A few forgot to write. Even the translators paused mid-sentence. Because Traoré wasn't negotiating anymore. He was declaring a doctrine. Across from him, MBS shifted in his seat, jaw tight, fingers tapping lightly on the armrest. He didn't interrupt. He didn't dare to. Traoré continued. "You speak of Africa's price as if we are a product. You speak of access, control, strategic partnerships. But I will tell you something that no one said to you before: Africa cannot be bought because Africa is not for sale. Not at 1 trillion. Not at 10 trillion. Not ever." He walked toward the Saudi delegation, not aggressively, but with the calm dominance of a man who knows exactly who he is, and more importantly, who he is not. "I don't need Arabia's money to lead my people," he said. "I need only their trust. And I have that. You, on the other hand, still try to buy the respect you cannot earn." Murmurs erupted. Cameras flashed like lightning in a desert storm. Someone gasped. One Saudi advisor lowered his gaze to the floor. Traoré wasn't finished. "You want a partner for Africa? Then approach us with honesty. Not with a checkbook. Approach us as equals. Not owners. Because the era of buying Africa ended before you even realized it had begun." MBS inhaled deeply, but still didn't speak. It wasn't fear, it was recognition. Recognition that Traoré was not playing the global political game by their rules. He was rewriting the rules in front of them. Traoré stepped back, raised his chin, and ended with a sentence that hit the world like thunder. "If you want Africa's friendship, you earn it. If you want Africa's obedience, you can keep dreaming." The room shook in applause. And for the first time in years, Africa spoke louder than wealth. The hall had never been quieter. Even the air felt frozen, as if afraid to move while Traoré stood facing MBS for the final time. Cameras flickered. Advisors stiffened. Every nation watching the summit leaned in, because this wasn't diplomacy anymore. This was a verdict. MBS tried to recover his composure, adjusting his gold-trimmed cufflinks like a man trying to regain control of a horse already galloping off a cliff. "Africa must know its limits," he said, forcing authority into a voice that no longer carried it. Traoré stepped closer, not threatening, but undeniable. "Limits," he repeated softly. "Africa had limits when others drew them. Now we draw our own." MBS opened his mouth again, perhaps to mention money, or influence, or the weight of Saudi Arabia's global clout, but Traoré raised a hand, stopping him with a simple gesture that said more than any speech. "You think Africa has a price," Traoré continued. "But only things that are weak can be bought. And Africa is not weak. Not anymore." The room tensed. A Saudi advisor whispered urgently into MBS's ear, but he didn't respond. His focus stayed locked on Traoré. As if he realized too late that this confrontation had slipped out of politics and into history. Traoré leaned in just enough for the microphones to capture every word. "Your money can build cities," he said, "but it cannot buy dignity. It cannot buy loyalty. And it will never buy Africa." The words hit harder than any sanction, any diplomatic threat, any billion-dollar investment could. Traoré wasn't rejecting an offer, he was rejecting an era. Then he delivered the final blow. "You said Africa has a price. I say Africa has a future. One you're not prepared for. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy. Transformative. The kind of silence that means a shift has happened, a line crossed, a balance broken. MBS stepped back. Not dramatically, not fearfully, simply involuntarily. As if some part of him recognized that the narrative he came to shape had been taken from his hands and rewritten in front of the entire world. Traoré turned away, not in disrespect, but in dismissal. The debate was over. The judgment had been passed. And for the first time in decades, Africa wasn't being spoken about. It was speaking, clearly enough for every leader on earth to hear. When Traoré left the hall, the cameras followed him, not the prince. Because history follows the man who changes it, not the one who tries to buy it. And that day, the world understood something new. Africa's rise wasn't coming. It was already here.